Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're going to take a look at the July-August 1923 issue of Weird Tales. So let's get right into it. This issue has about 100 pages, so roughly 20 less than the previous one, but it still contains 13 short stories, 2 novelettes, and again 2 two-part stories, so the end of a serial and the start of another one. The first serial that started in this issue is called Sunfire, in which some adventurers are going up a tropical river where they've heard there's an island where ancient buildings are. The person who told them about it is not very clear as to what there is there. So after about 2 weeks of canoeing up the river, they see an island in it. They see that there's a pyramid on the island. They disembark. They see that there's a whole bunch of boats that seem to be in various states of disrepair. Some seem like they've been moored there maybe a month ago. Others clearly have been there for decades. They've all rotted away and half sunk in the water. And they think these are people who previously went there or maybe belong to the inhabitants of the island, but why would they not get rid of the old boats doesn't make sense to them until they see a hydroplane that looks brand new. And they figure, well, maybe somebody landed the plane there is in need of rescue. We're here, we can check it out, and we know now to be careful. So they start exploring. They approach the pyramid and climb up it. And on top of it, they see a strange construction that consists of 8 columns and a huge, brilliant crystal of some sort that's glowing with light that sits on top of these columns. They also see a young lady that seems to be dancing with an enormous centipede of some sort. The illustration that comes with this story is a bit misleading. The girl, I should say, is described as wearing a leopard skin. And clearly whatever weird creature is illustrated there is not a centipede. The 5 men are all charmed by this young lady, who doesn't seem to understand any of the languages that they try. They explore a little bit. She offers them some fruits, which they eat. She leaves while they inspect the area. They discover that the giant crystal on top of those columns has a pit below it that's filled with soot, and that there are large stone slabs that if you step on them, they will tilt and cause you to slide into that pit. The girl comes back and she has wine that she offers them, and they drink it. At this point, they all fall unconscious and wake up dressed in leopard skins, chained in individual cells. They don't know what's going to happen, but they quickly figure out that this enormous crystal, which one of them believes to be a diamond, even though it is meters in diameter, has been polished in such a way that it will focus the light of the sun underneath it, and the sacrifices to the sun god will be put underneath there and burn. There the story ends, and we will find out if our adventurers escape in the next issue of Weird Tales. The next story is called The Outcasts. It starts with a man who is trying to catch a rabbit or glean some food from fields. He's hiding from others. We find out he's hiding from a posse and a sheriff. Clearly he's an outlaw of some sort. He's hungry, it's cold, he's not dressed properly. And he'll come across a dog. The dog will sort of try to befriend him. He will chip some ice so that the dog can drink. And while the dog is licking at the ice, he will take his club and try to hit it. At which point the dog isn't very happy with him, but will still hang around with him. As he's hiding from the posse that's looking for him, he has a close encounter with the sheriff that's hunting him down. And the sheriff at this point is alone, and he will club the sheriff, hide the body in the bushes, take his gun. Meanwhile, the dog has tracked down a rabbit, and the man catches him eating it, and he's hungry, and he's angry at the dog for catching the rabbit and eating it all without him getting any. He will attack the dog, but he doesn't want to use the rifle he got from the sheriff because he doesn't want the noise. During the fight, he sort of realizes that it's not a dog, it's a wolf, and the story ends with the dog still wandering the countryside alone. the wolf part of him relishing being free and in the wilderness, but the dog part of him giving him a conscience and sort of vaguely feeling guilty for having killed a man. I like this story. It reminds me of some other adventure tales of that time with animals. I'm thinking Jack London here, but it's not quite as well written, though it's still quite competent. It didn't have the lasting power of The Call of the Wild or anything like that. The next story is The Room of the Black Velvet Drapes. It concerns a journalist who goes to interview a famous psychologist, goes to the psychologist's house. He will be made welcome and asked to wait in the study, which is this circular room with black velvet drapes and a bunch of sarcophagi. The drapes absorb all sound. It makes things feel weird. The journalist is feeling tense because of all of this. The psychologist comes back and slowly he shows creatures he's created. They're humans and he's stripped them of everything except for one emotion. So there's one that represents hatred and one that represents fear and one that represents joy and so on and so forth. And then he announces that he is going to do the same thing to the journalist. It's an interesting story. I can see how in the early days of psychology and psychiatry, this kind of story would have a big impact. I think commonplace knowledge of these fields by the average person does mean that the suspension of disbelief is slightly more difficult. Nevertheless, an interesting story. The next story is Dr. X. And this one is about two men who discuss a news item about an old professor they knew who's recently shot to fame claiming he can transplant a brain from one animal to another. One of them is doubtful that it can be done, and they discuss the matter, and a man interrupts them saying, "Oh, but I do have some knowledge about this," and he talks about how someone who their professor knew, let's call him Dr. X, worked with him, and the goal was to transplant the human brain. And the big reveal is that the person speaking to them is Professor X, but in the body of somebody younger. So he managed to do the brain graft. A kind of fun story in a way. The punchline is a bit predictable, but maybe that's because we have, as I've mentioned before in one of these reviews, a century of stories to draw from that the people who wrote this story didn't have. Next we have The Two Men Who Murdered Each Other. It starts with an antique dealer. As he's out hunting the stores in the countryside, he's in the Cape Cod area, and he finds drawings, paintings that mimic ancient Greek vases, and they're very well done. And he finds out that the artist is actually just lives right here, like within walking distance. And he determines to go see the man. And it's this old man who appreciates the antique dealer's knowledge of classical Greek art. And so he will tell him his story, which is about 40 or 50 years previous. Him and a colleague went on behalf of their university to purchase some antique Greek artifacts. They come across a great vase. It is exquisitely painted. He wants to write a paper because it would change the chronology of ancient Greek art, put one of the artists to be about 50 years before when it was thought that he lived, whereas the person who he went with has no such scholarly goals. He actually will acquire that vase by perhaps not the most honest of means, with his own money, not the university's, and he claims, "Oh, I want to keep it for my collection." And so this debate comes across between the men, one of whom wants it to go into a museum and be studied for posterity and all that, and the other one who just wants to keep it for himself. This is a theme we'll see decades later in Indiana Jones, and it's interesting that it's come up quite early in one of these stories. Less of a adventuring archaeologist story, but still a tale related to archaeology. Now what happens is that vase is actually broken in two halves, and each one will get their hands on one half. They agree on a truce. The ship that they're taking to go back home will be caught in a storm, and they will both climb into a small boat because the ship is sinking. Both of them want to keep an eye on the other and the other half of the vase, and they will land on a small deserted island. They ran out of food and water. They had very little water. They could only collect some rainwater. The narrator of the story says, well, I had a bit of food on me, which I hid from the other. I could see him weaken. I was planning to murder him, and I have a memory of doing so, but the next thing I know is I was on the boat, which at this point was leaking. Only one person could be on it. Two people would cause it to sink eventually. I had my half of the vase, but not the other half. And so I murdered this man and chose to live this life of isolation away from academia, and I stopped interacting with that world as my penance for what I've done. And then this antique dealer will come across at an auction some quite well-to-do man. He will have discussions after the auction with this man who will invite him for supper. So he goes to visit this man's house, and a man shows off his collection, and he quickly puts two and two together, and this collector is the person he was told about who'd been murdered, and he sees the other half of the vase, which just confirms it for him. So this rich man also believes that he killed his rival by putting him on the boat and pushing him out to sea, knowing that he'd accumulated some driftwood and he had matches, which the other didn't know about. So if he saw a ship on the horizon, he could light a fire and attract their attention, which is actually how he did get off that island. In the end, the old man just gives his half of the vase to the other because he still feels guilty about having tried to kill him. This is much to the delight of the rich collector and the disgust of the antique dealer, who regrets bringing these two people together because he thought they could, first of all, expunge their guilt, but perhaps patch things up. It was an interesting story. I liked the theme of it belongs in a museum, it belongs to humanity, not to a single collector, in that conflict. It's nice to see it appear early on and not just have people recklessly looting civilizations in remote parts of the world with no moral thought to it. The next story is The Strange Case of Jacob Aram. This is rather long and a bit convoluted. It concerns the titular character, who is quite a recluse, lives in a small village, though no one's seen him. The only contact they have is with his servant, who goes about town doing whatever purchases. One of the locals is asked to come and visit him. He's a lawyer or something. There's a mention of him maybe being a judge. It's not clear to me. And he's basically being asked to be the executor of Jacob's will, which he agrees to do. And this is where he also meets the titular character's niece, who is here for a short visit. She and her mother will be the beneficiaries of the will, except for some money going to a servant and some going to the executor. She feels that the servant is actually controlling her uncle in some ways. She's worried, it's unclear. Jacob refuses to see any doctors, though he's clearly ill and not doing well, which of course his niece isn't happy about. And there's also a local professor who studied witchcraft and has been writing a book about it since forever, who believes the servant, who is of some African origin, to maybe exercise witchcraft in some form. Eventually, Jacob will pass away, but be revived by some witchcraft performed by his servant. At this point, because his niece has called in for a doctor, which he didn't want, he basically tells her to go back home. I don't want to see you anymore. He also announces his intention to change his will. She's not going to get any money anymore. Shortly after he moves out, the narrator, who's that lawyer, that professor and the doctor, they still wonder about what happened. movers have come to take the furniture out of the house and they decide to go and check it out one last time. And the professor, thinking of finding evidence of witchcraft, specifically the buried bodies of black birds or whatnot that might have been sacrificed, starts to dig around in the garden where he saw that some earth had been moved recently. And what he finds is the body of Jacob Aram. Turns out that the live version of him is actually his twin brother that people thought had died many years before. And the whole thing was a plot by the twin brother and the servant to get all the money that belonged to Jacob Aram. Nothing actually supernatural, although there's a belief by the characters of some supernatural goings on. It is clearly a weird tale, but I felt it was quite long, the plot convoluted, and the conclusion was a bit of a letdown. Maybe I've read too many evil twin stories, and maybe too many of those have been published since July 1923. The next story is Black Conjure, which is a shortening of conjurer, I would assume. And it's about a witch doctor who practices voodoo, or at least is reputed to do so. Some people say he's 200 years old. A local judge remembers when he was young that this witch doctor had recently married. However, the judge himself is very old and most people don't take what he says about this too seriously. He lives an isolated life in a patch of woods. Some company has purchased the rights to chop those trees down. Most members of the crew don't want to go chop those trees down. They're afraid of the curses they might receive. The foreman is not only a no-nonsense guy, he's very tough and will often intimidate the crews into working. Eventually, he will himself go to the conjurer's house and kill him in a fit of rage. As he goes home, he feels his foot is wet and he takes off his boot and he sees there's blood and he feels pain. By the time he gets back to the logging camp where others are, he's not far from death and he passes away quite quickly. This could all be attributed to witchcraft, but it turns out that the door sill of the conjurer's house was made out of rotten wood, and there were 3 axe blades embedded inside. You wouldn't see them at first, but if you stepped on the door sill, your foot would go through and be cut by those blades. That presumably is what caused the death. I didn't think this story was too interesting. There's a big buildup of the powers he may have, and all it turns out is some weird little trap. It's not clear why he would have put that trap there in the first place, since people stepping into the house may not necessarily step on the door sill. The next story is called Shades. While it says it's a ghost story, it's also a crime story, and it's told from the point of view of the ghost, who in his life was a leader of a gang. They would target large corporations and very rich people, and faced with a choice of escaping the police at one point, but the rest of the gang being arrested, or the rest of the gang escaping but him being arrested, he chooses the latter. He gets arrested, goes to prison. He is paroled unexpectedly early. And when he comes back, he finds out his wife has divorced him and his partner, whom he's known since he was a child, has married her. He's angry about this, so he takes a gun and goes to their hideout, pulls out his gun, the gun jams, he is killed, and from then on, he's a ghost. He's trying to get in touch with people. Anytime he sort of manages, it's somebody sees a ghost of him and is scared. He can't seem to communicate. Eventually, though, his partner will die, and he will be there, and then both ghosts will live a happy afterlife. I don't know. It's well written. Didn't do much for me, but it might appeal to others more. Next is not a story, but an article about what they term a weird cult, voodooism. It's about voodoo. I assume people here know what it is. It's a bit of a rundown, the African roots, and then how it got to North America. A few examples of what voodoo is about. I find it's a little bit disconnected. They talk specifically about one practitioner of voodoo, but it's not clear if this person actually existed or not. This is skippable. The next story is Senorita Serpente. The titular character is a woman who charms men and will basically turn them into crawling things if she doesn't outright kill them. I just couldn't get into this story. The first page is a setup of what she does, but there's tons of names that are tossed in that aren't really relevant. Makes it hard to follow who is who. Two men come into town. One of them warns the other that he should not get involved with any women. He, of course, does not follow his companion's advice, upon which the companion goes along with the local priest to where the woman has dragged his friend to, and they will manage to prevent the friend's death, and the woman will never again charm men the way she has. It didn't really thrill me, and I felt the writing was a bit too convoluted for the simplicity of the story. The Room in the Tower concerns a guest in a Scottish manor. There's a tower where there's a room that is reputed to be haunted. The ghosts never leave that room, however, and the guest decides he's going to spend the night there. Of course, he sees the spirits appear, they terrify him, and he vows to never again seek out the company of ghosts. It was a very typical ghost story. There's not much else to say, in my opinion, about it. If you like this sort of thing, you'll enjoy it. Riders in the Dark concerns a gang of men who go to the residence of a certain Robert Hamlin, upon whom a sentence has been passed, and they are to kill the man. His wife is reputedly very beautiful, so they will ride out to the man's house. One of them will be sent to scout. He will see the woman, instantly fall in love with her. He'll report back to his colleagues that the man is alone with his wife, but that the wife should be protected. They will surround the house. 4 of them are designated to be the firing squad. One of them, the captain, enters the house and the man agrees to leave, but he just wants a few minutes with his wife before he does, which he is granted. The captain tells him he'll be waiting outside. As the door opens again, they see the man, or so they think. However, the scout realizes it's his wife. He screams out to not shoot. However, he's too late. The other 3 in the firing squad shoot. Of course, she's shot. They realize it's not him. And on the other side of the house where the man was attempting to escape, other members of this squad shoot him down. I don't really give this story justice. I really liked it. We don't know who these writers are or why they do what they do, but the tension mounts quite well. While there are no outright supernatural elements, there's certainly this element of odd happenings, like who is this squad of men who ride to execute a sentence passed upon somebody who may or may not even know that they've been sentenced. Although there's hints that what they do is the work of justice, we can never be sure. We don't even know what this man, Robert Hamlin, has done to warrant being condemned to death. I like this story and I recommend it. Next is Mandrake, which is a story about 2 friends, one of whom is a doctor, and he talks about a young lady that he knows whose family has recently passed away in a not too distant past. She seems to be getting worse and be rather distressed about it all. Apparently, she's gotten involved with a person who's a hypnotist of some sort. They will eventually discover that she was convinced to plant a mandrake over her father's tomb. If she was to pull it out after it's grown there for one night and it screamed, then that would prove her dad, who was executed for murder, which he claimed he didn't commit, was actually guilty of said murder. In the very end, it's found that the person who was in charge of the inheritance for this young lady, because she's a minor, has been embezzling the funds, and he enlisted the aid of the hypnotist to cause her to either go crazy or kill herself so that his part in the fund embezzlement wouldn't be discovered. What's interesting is that it's not clear if the mandrake root is actually really magical in any way. And I like the kind of stories where you're never sure whether magic is actually there. Next we have tucked away in a corner. Two firsts. The first poem that Weird Tales has published in its pages, and simultaneously the first appearance by Clark Ashton Smith in the pages of the magazine. This is in the form of a poem called The Garden of Evil, which I quite liked. I'm far from an expert on poetry. What I consider to be a good poem is one that evokes interesting images in my mind or amuses me, and this one does the former very well. The next story is People vs. Bland. This is about a lawyer who talks about an experience he had when he was starting out. He had an office in an old building. Because he liked to work in quiet, he often would work late at night because that would help him concentrate. As he's doing so, late one night, a man shows up and asks him to represent his brother, saying that the trial is the very next morning at 10:30 and gives him which courthouse he has to go to. The next morning, he's half tempted to dismiss the whole thing because he has no information whatsoever about the case, but he nevertheless decides to show up at the courthouse. It turns out there's already a lawyer for the defense, but he knows this person. He approaches him and says, well, look, there seems to be a confusion because a relative of the defendant has asked me to represent him. Do you mind if I sit with you? The other lawyer agrees. The case doesn't look good. He basically just sits there and tries to absorb as much information as he can to figure out what's happening. Talking to the defendant, who's accused of murdering his brother, he gets the feeling that the man is innocent. That night, he works late, trying to prepare for the next day of the trial. He gets a second visit, giving him a name of someone who can help. The next day, he has time to do a bit of work before having to be in court. The trial continues, and it turns out the person whose name he was given, he managed to get her to show up. She testifies that she has seen something that no one else had seen. It implicates somebody else who is in the courtroom, and as this happens, has a stroke of some sort. He manages to confess, thus exonerating the defendant. Afterwards, discussing the case with the defendant and the other lawyer, he says, your brother and you will be able to see each other again. And the man says, what do you mean? My brother is dead. I only have one brother. It seems that the late night visits were by the ghost of the deceased brother. So a fun little story, nice little courtroom drama combined with a bit of supernatural. I quite enjoyed it. The next story is The Evening Wolves, which is the second part of the serial that was started in the previous issue. The second part is actually quite shorter than the first part, and so wraps up a lot faster than I would have expected. Just as a quick recap, this strange Oriental is dispatching the members of a gang of criminals in his rather exotic house. He has traps and other strange things there. Here we see the final criminals being taken care of, and we find out what his motivation is, which is that when he was much younger, an orphan, and no one wanted to help him in any way, this humanitarian did help him, and these gangsters basically swindled her and left her destitute. This is his revenge for what they did to her. I wasn't in love with the story in the last issue. This hasn't done much to make me really like it. Not much else to say, really. Next we have The Corpse on the Third Slab. This is the story of Officer Ryan. He's a watchman. He has to keep watch in the morgue. Apparently somebody has been stealing bodies. As the night progresses, he thinks that he sees the body on the third slab move. He's brought with him a bottle of moonshine that a friend of his has given him. He sips it to get through the night. Eventually, he'll become so scared about this body maybe moving that he'll just sit facing the other way, and at one point he will fall asleep, wake up with a start. He thinks he's maybe fallen asleep for a short while, but it's maybe been an hour or two. And he hears some footsteps behind him. upon which he has a rather surreal conversation with the corpse in question, the corpse claiming he's not dead and terrifying him. The corpse then deciding it's going to go and lie down for a nap. The man himself is frozen with fear. Eventually, the morning comes, as do a couple of people. He thinks he's imagined it all, but then he sees evidence that the corpse has moved in the shape of a handprint on a recently painted wall, and he sees that same paint on the hand of the corpse. And he recalls that the corpse was standing there and did lean against the wall. The conversation was quite enjoyable, and the run-up to the whole thing really gets into the mind of someone who's afraid but doesn't believe in the supernatural and tries to deny what's happening until the evidence is there and can't be ignored anymore. And even then, he still tries to deny it, thinking, oh, that was all a dream I had because I fell asleep. That was a good one. I liked it. The Guard of Honor is a story divided in two parts. The first part is the Guard of Honor in question. Three men who are watching over the body of a friend the night before the burial, and they discuss a little bit what he was like. Apparently he was a brilliant surgeon, but he had no memory of his youth. Apparently he was very, very ill in his late teens or early 20s, and he had to relearn everything from scratch. Then we cut to the deceased person back when he was alive, just before his death, having remembered something from his youth, and it was the name of a village, and going to that village, his memories flooding back, and he goes into the house of someone he knew. The house is now in ruins. There's been a fire or something. All his memories come back, and the shock of it all will kill him. The first part wasn't really needed. It could have been cut by at least half, if not more. There's no reason for him to have been a brilliant doctor. It doesn't add anything to the plot of the man recovering his memories. The fact that it's divided into two very clear halves, I think, weakened the plot. Maybe cutting back and forth might have made for a more interesting story. As it is, dividing it like that in two just made me lose interest too quickly because I could sort of see what had happened. The foreshadowing is too strong in the first half, so that it's too easy to predict the second half. Next, we have The Cauldron, which was the people writing in strange events that they witnessed or lived. And The Eerie, again, the letters section. Nothing too much of interest here this time. I was disappointed to see that there was no masterpiece of weird fiction, which I would have enjoyed seeing again. Hopefully there'll be some more in future issues. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, looking at the July-August 1923 issue of Weird Tales, and I'll see you next time.